وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على إمام المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وشأن الفخيم وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us to be able to complete looking at the conditions of prayer, and then after that to start looking at the integrals of the prayer. And in looking at the integrals of the prayer, we looked at the sajda, right? After looking at the ruku'. Now the ruku' and sujood are related in that both of them arise from a decisive command, right? They both arise from a decisive command that is khas, right? So these are useful to look at in terms of the aslul istidlal, right? The basis of the reasoning, and we touched upon that, and that is quite important, right? That's quite important. The component elements of that, if you wished to be diligent, you could gather a few component parts. What is the amr, right? And for that, if someone wants to gather these from al-Mujaz lil-As'adi, and we can include these as a resource, right? And just do a quick translation of them for those following, that would be quite useful. There's the amr, right? There's what is the amr, what is the khas, what is the am, right? And dipping into the Mujaz of al-As'adi, just do a brief idiomatic translation of those. That is quite useful, and we've touched upon that last class. So the amr falls under the category of that which is decisively established in the Quran, right? Because in the Hanafi school, the fact that the Prophet ﷺ did something itself does not indicate that it's a duty. In fact, the amr, the command, is not understood from an action. Dilalatul qawl aqwa min dilalatil fi'l. The indication of an action is stronger than the indication of, the indication of a word of speech is stronger than the indication of the words. Because especially like a command, right? And a duty is understood either by an explicit command or that which is akin to a command, right? So yes, we are commanded to follow the Prophet ﷺ, but that command is broad, right? And the levels of following are in accordance with, so it's obligatory to follow the Prophet ﷺ in the obligatory, sunnah to follow him in the sunnah, recommended to follow him in the recommended, permitted to follow him in the permissible. But then it's impermissible to follow him in that which is exclusive to him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his khasa'is, right? Etc. Okay. So we stopped at وَبِجَبْهَتِهِ, right? So we reached that was sujood. So he tells us that the integral is the sujood, and عَلَى مَا يَجِدُ حَجْمَهُ, that which you can feel your weight on, i.e., you can feel the weight of the ground, or your weight on the ground. And the meaning is close, right? That when you press, you can feel the pressure, such that were you to press harder, you wouldn't just keep sinking without feeling that resistance, right? Okay. It is valid to prostrate on your hand or the side of your garment or part of your garment, however, but not on filth, right? And then he says, وَسَجْدَ وُجُوبًا عَلَى صَلُبًا مِنْ أَنْفِهِ. It is wajib to prostrate on, with the forehead, on the firm part of your nose. That's wajib. And then Imam Shrumbulali says, وَلَا يَصِحُّ الْاقْتِصَارُ عَلَى الْأَنْفِ إِلَّا مِنْ عُذْرٍ بِالْجَبْهَةِ. Right? It is not, he says, it is not permitted to, it's not valid to prostrate only on one's nose, i.e., أي دون الجبهة, without the forehead, right? Right? Without there being an excuse with the forehead, right? So Imam Shrumbulali here says, لأن الأصح أن الإمام رجع إلى موافقة صاحبيه في عدم جواز الشروع في الصلاة بالفارسية لغير العاجز عن العربية، وعدم جواز القراءة فيها بالفارسية وغيرها من أي لسان غير العربي لغير العاجز عن العربية، وعدم جواز الاقتصار في السجود على الأنف بلا عذر في الجبهة لحديث أمرت أن أسجد لسبعة أعظم على الجبهة الحديث. Okay, so we read this whole thing because so he says that it is not valid to prostrate just on one's nose without there being an excuse with on the forehead, right? And he says fil asah, according to the more correct opinion, right? Now, right? Now we discussed this issue previously with respect to what? So now he says that because the more correct opinion is that the Imam came back to agreement with his companions with respect to the impermissibility of beginning the prayer with al-Farisi, with non-Arabic, for the one unable to, for other than the one incapable of saying it in Arabic. So here there's three issues, right? There's a tahrima, الشروع بالفارسية, is beginning the prayer in other than Arabic. The second issue is al-qira'a بالفارسية, right? The second is reciting in other than Arabic for the one unable to recite in Arabic. And the third issue, which he sort of bundles together, but we can separate them, which is prostrating only on one's nose without there being an excuse on one's forehead. So he bundles them together, right? That Imam Abu Hanifa used to say that you could prostrate with your nose only, with ikhtisar al-anf, you could prostrate only on your nose without touching your forehead. And this goes back to lexical issue, and you can find it even in Qamus al-Muhit, that prostration, is it to place the forehead on the ground or to place something of the face in a مما لا سخرية فيه, and we quoted the definition from al-Bahr al-Ra'iq as well, right? Is a sajda wad'u al-jabhati ala al-ard? That's the argument that's made by the Sahibain. Or is it to place something of your face on the ground, Sajada is to go down and put your face on the ground. What if you put your face but only your nose touched? Right? So this issue, right? And we've discussed this before, right? Just when he mentions sujood, that this opinion was dismissed in the Fath, right? That both in meaning and transmission, right? In meaning, the diraya, why? Because sujood is a lafz khas, right? What does sujood indicate? Is to place a face on the ground, right? And you can see that in al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, for example, etc. Then, after that, second issue is, so here, Abu Hanifa did not go back. So the issue of, so it's good to separate these three issues. Beginning the prayer with other than Arabic. Is it valid to begin with other than Arabic? For the one able? Right? And this is important to keep track of because we mentioned Imam al-Shurunbulali, the way he presented this issue here and in the Shurunbulaliya and others too, notables, including Al-Aini, on these three issues, there's some murkiness. And if you can diagram that, I'd be very happy. These three issues. And Tahtawi gets it correct. You can find it, and if you guys work on it together, you can find it also in Maulana Ibn Abdin, who deals with it with some brevity, but it's there, right? 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 So, right? Right? And in Hashid ibn Abdin, right, this comes up. Right? And one of the things that in Hashid ibn Abdin you have to keep in mind that most of the discussion, because there is a summarized section in the Tanweer called Babu Sifat al-Salah, right? Where in summary he mentions the integrals, and minha al-ruku' minha al-sujud, right? He doesn't go into it at length, right? And then there is an unpacking of this afterwards, right? And there's an unpacking of that in an upcoming section, right? In an upcoming section on كيفية تركيب أفعال الصلاة. So, and the reason that's important to be aware of is that many of the details come later. So some people just read one section in Hashd ibn Abdin and they get confused by it, right? So right? And that section on that section actually is page 322. He has either aradish, it's called fasl, it's very non-discrepant, fasl, and there in Hashd ibn Abdin, it has a full description of the prayer, and that's a section that's full of fawaid. But that's where it goes into extensive discussion on the conditions and integrals. And there, I'll just get you to the page. Where's Judu? Right? So, and this is where the issue is discussed, right? So it's page 325 of the Hashia, right? Right? And you can see the discussion there, right? So it's page 325 of Hashiyat ibn Abdin. Okay. And this, so it comes up again here. 325. The summary is that it's valid to prostrate just on the nose, according to Imam Abu Hanifa. The Sahibain said no. And that khilaf is thabit, but and then he also goes into the issue of putting both hands, etc., right? Which we'll be coming to. That all is discussed there at length. But of course, this is in terms of validity, right? So if someone only prostrated with their nose, according to Abu Hanifa's position, and it would appear that he did not go back on it, the prayer will be valid, but makruh tahriman. But with respect to past practice, it would be validated. According to Sahibain, the prayer would not be valid unless there's an excuse with the forehead. But even then, given the khilaf, with respect to past practice, it would be valid. Nobody would suggest doing it anyways because either it's not valid or it's makruh tahriman. Right? Okay. It says, ومن شروط صحة السجود عدم ارتفاع محل السجود عن موضع القدمين بأكثر من نصف ذراع. And from the conditions of validity of prostration is that the place of prostration not be higher than where the feet are by more than half a dhira. Right? Half a dhira, half an arm's length, so more than 25 centimeters. ليتحقق صفة الساجد, so that the quality of being in prostration be realized. So he says, وَالْإِرْتِفَاعُ الْقَلِيلِ لَا يَضُرُّ, and a slight elevation does not harm. This, of course, unless the natural incline of the earth. Right? This is, because that's, like if so you're praying on a mountain, the Qibla is that way, towards the Qibla. So this is, that no, you don't have, for example, what if you're praying on the ground and you've got a pillow in front of you? If it's small, it doesn't harm. If it's large, it's not. And this, they made the taqdeer of nisf dhira. There are other opinions, right? That it just, if it's considered small, it doesn't harm. If it's big, it harms. وإن زاد على نصف ذراع لم يجوز السجود أو لم يجزي السجود. Both are valid. If it's more than half a dhira, this prostration is not valid. أي لم يقع معتدا به. It's not considered sujood. Because it doesn't have the meaning of ta'zeem. Right? So because, for example, if you put your forehead on the table, on the ground, right? Is that more than 25 centimeters? Put your, Measure with your hand. Yeah. Is it on the ground? Your finger? Yeah. So imagine if you're prostrating on it. Does that look like a prostration? Not really. If it's slightly higher, right? فإن فعل غيره معتبرا صحت. If one does that and then does another prostration that is a recognized prostration, it will be valid. So for example, someone they didn't want to prostrate on the ground, so they put a ground table that's 40 centimeters tall. They prostrated their head on that. So, oh no, I shouldn't have done that. They did another prostration, it'll be valid. Right? وَإِنْ صَرَفَ مِنْ صَلَاتِهِ وَلَمْ يُعِدْهُ بَطَلَتْ. But if one left the prayer and did not repeat that prostration, the prayer would be invalidated. And we'll see the issue of what if one omits one of the sajdas of the prayer, right? And we'll touch upon that when we get to the wajib actions of the prayer. وَإِلَّا, there's one exception. إِلَّا أَنْ يَكُونَ ذَلِكَ لِزَحْمَةٍ سَجْدَ فِيهَا عَلَى ظَهْرِ مُصَلٍّ صَلَاتَهُ لِلضَّرُورَةِ. Unless one is in a crowded situation and one prostrated in it on the back of someone who's praying the same prayer as you out of necessity. فإن لم يكن ذلك المسجود عليه مصليا أو كان في صلاة أخرى لا يصح السجود. But if the person, if what you prostrated on was not another person praying, or the person was in another prayer, it would not be valid. I've done this once in my life, indirectly, where someone prayed on my back. It was not a good experience. But I don't remember if I put my head on someone's back, but I don't think so. At least if it was too traumatic to remember. But then you will notice that he does. So there's a discussion, because the asl of the sajda, what this Allah's command is, irka'u wasjudu, right? Prostrate. Now, bima yatahaq. So we know what a prostration is. But now, what about these other limbs? Because they're not part of the prostration itself, but you can't prostrate without the other limbs because they're part of your body. So the matan itself says, وَوَضْعُ الْيَدَيْنِ وَالرُّكْبَتَيْنِ فِي الصَّحِيحِ. Right? So the matan indicates that you place both arms and both knees according to the sound opinion. وَشَيْءٍ مِّنْ أَصَابِعِ الرِّجْلَيْنِ, and something of the toes of both feet. Right? He puts that first in Nur al-Idah. But by the time he gets from Nur al-Idah, and then you see what's there in the Imdad and what's there in the Maraqi, what happens? The Imdad is over there. Right? He adjusts his opinion. Right? Or at least adjusts what he says. So he says, وَمِن شَرْطِ صِحَّةِ السُّجُودِ, from the conditions of the validity of the prostration, وَضْعُ إِحْدَى الْيَدَيْنِ, is to place one of the two hands. وَإِحْدَى الرُّكْبَتَيْنِ, and one of the two knees. فِي الصَّحِيحِ, according to the sound opinion. So he adjusted it. كما قدمنا, as we've mentioned previously. Right? وَوَضْعُ شَيْءٍ مِّنْ أَصَابِعِ الرِّجْلَيْنِ, and to place something of the toes of both feet. Right? What did you say? The ihda is there in the imdad as well. But then there's another thing, and this is, the challenge. They say, man al-faqih man ghalaba sawabuhu ala khata'ih, right? Then there's another thing. This causes people to stumble. Then he says, موجها بباطنه نحو القبلة. Pointing the bottom of the toes towards the qibla. Where are we right now? In the text, not physically. We're in different places, right? Where are we in the text? Yeah, the conditions and integrals of the prayer. What should be mentioned here? What's fard? If it's not fard, it should be mentioned explicitly. And he mentions a few wajib actions, etc. Right? And here, موجها بباطنه نحو القبلة. This is هذا بيان للسنة. This comes up later explicitly in the text under the makruhat as-salah. Doesn't it mention not making tawjih of the asabi' نحو القبلة? Yeah, right. So it's from the makruhat of the prayer, right? And we'll see there, it'll come up the ruling. It's makruh, right? And we'll see the ta'leel, the reasoning given is because it's litarki sunnati tawjih, because of leaving the sunnah of tawjih, right? And from the sunan of the prayer that other texts mention, I'm not sure is it listed amongst the sunan of the salah? توجيه أصابع يديه ورجليه نحو القبلة? No. Right? فموجها صفة الصلاة. Right? So it's there in the description of prayer, it's in the makruhat of the prayer. This is why don't treat fiqh texts like murder mysteries. Let's see what happens later. Right? These are interconnected. This is very important. This is not up for discussion, right? Like reading this here, right? That's what apply what al-Atasi says about one of the other what Rustum Baz says, what he says about Rustum Baz, in Sharh al-Majah says وَدَعَنْ كَمَا قَالَهُ الشارح رستم باز فإنه يتمسك بالمباني ولا يدرك المعاني. And leave aside what the commentator Rustum Baz says here, because he holds on to the words and doesn't understand the meanings. And one of the common errors is, this is mujmal, he mentions muwajjihan, turning. What's your dalil that it's fard? Because we're talking about the fara'id. Okay, that's muhtamil. That's بدلالة المقام. But العبارة أقوى من الدلالة. Right? And the ibarat are clear in what's coming in the text in two places, in the tarkib af'al al-salah and the makruhat al-salah. And this is also mentioned explicitly in Hashit ibn Abdin. وَتَوْجِيهُ الْأَصَابِعَ نَحْوَ الْقِبْلَةِ السُنَّةِ. Right? And he mentions كذا في حاشية الرمل على البحر. And this is also in in حلبة المجلي, right? He says التوجيه سنة عندنا قولا واحدا. Not just, so this is a mistake. The reason I'm mentioning this because some people say it's wajib, it's fard, etc., etc., and it's not correct, right? There he says التوجيه سنة عندنا قولا واحدا خلافا لما مشى عليه الحسكفي تبعا لشرح المنية. So some notables have okay. Allah. Okay. Face, موجها بباطن أصابعه, pointing with, with the bottom of one's feet towards the Qibla. This is Sunnah. حالة السجود على الأرض, while in prostration on the ground. ولا يكفي لصحة السجود وضع ظاهر القدم. And it's not sufficient to simply place the top of the feet أي دون الأصابع, without any of the toes touching. لأنه ليس محله لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم أمرت أن أسجد على 7 أعظم على الجبهة واليدين والركبتين وأطراف القدمين. Because the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said, I have been commanded to prostrate on 7 limbs, the hands, the knees, and the tips of the feet, meaning the toes. أطراف القدمين, the tips of the feet, meaning the toes. The hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim. According to him, though it might just be in Muslim, وهو اختيار الفقيه, right? And this is what's mentioned by al-Faqih, right? Right? Al-Faqih is, they say there's Al-Faqih Abu Ja'far, which is Al-Hundwani, and Al-Faqih frequently refers to Al-Faqih Abu Layth Al-Samarqandi, right? Author of the famous Muqaddimah and many great works, and the great tafsir and many other things. One of the great Hanafis. Also author of the brilliant work Tanbihul Ghafilin and Bustanul Arifin, two of the great works of wa'az in the Hanafi madhab and fiqh al-taqwa. Okay. واختلف في الجواز مع وضع قدم واحدة, and they differed on the validity while placing one foot, right? Right? أي بقدم واحدة أي دون الأخرى, right? Right? Because I say شيء من أصابع الرجلين, right? And Ibn Abdin does tahqiq of this in the same place that we mentioned in Bab Sifat al-Salah, right? 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 And والحاصل, Ibn Abdin has a hasil, right? 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 So there's a lengthy discussion, but so at the basic level, right? If one put the toes of one foot only, meaning the second foot never touched the ground, it would be valid, but makruh tahriman, right? It's wajib to put both hands, both knees, and at least one toe from both feet, at least for a moment. Minimally. Putting the both sets of each is wajib, at least for a moment. And you can read the Tahqiq in Ibn Abdin, etc., if you wish. But of course, caution. Some people go way over the top. They treat they turn this as a fitna for people. They have to, if that every toe has to touch the ground. There's no dalil for that, because al-asabi' refers to all of them. No, because al-mutlaq yansarif ila al-mu'tad. The unconditioned goes to the normal. Someone puts their toes on the ground and the little toe is curled up and it doesn't touch. And so there's some really strange things out there, right? ويشترط لصحة الركوع والسجود تقديم الركوع على السجود. It's a condition for the validity of the ruku' and sujood that one performed the ruku' before the sujood. كما يشترط تقديم القراءة على الركوع. Just as it's a requirement that the recitation be before the ruku'. على الركوع لم يبقى بعده قيام. That it be before a ruku', before, after which there isn't a standing. يصح به فرض القراءة, in which you could perform the fard qira'ah. Right? Right? And here, الطحطاوي quotes قاضي Ibn, so he quotes Ibn Qadi Samawina, and sometimes they have Ibn Samawi, or it's Ibn Samawina, from Sharh al-Tasheel, and that's a great work. Right? That so the house is that doing these in order, and this listed from the fara'id of the prayer, right? And they said, what's the difference between a rukun and a fard? Right? That the fard is maqsood, the rukun is not maqsood. And we'll see a little more about this, right? So if someone to make ruku' before the sujood, so if one was standing and fell to prostration, what happens? They have to stand back up and do ruku', then sujood. That sajda would be mulgha. It wouldn't count. Because there's a fard which was not fulfilled, which is this order, right? And from the fard, right, is also min al-fard, right? This will come up with the wajib min al-fard. You need sajdatan لكل ركعة, والواجب ركعتان, يعني والواجب أن تكون في كل ركعة. Right? It is obligatory that one prostrate twice, لكل ركعة, for each rak'ah, and wajib that it be in each rak'ah. And we'll see the discussion on that in the wajib, right? So someone just, of course, if you have a doubt after the prayer, the asl is that your prayer is valid. Al-aslu as-sihha. And the ihtimal, even the shak, even the dhann, that, oh, I don't think I prostrated twice, that is ignored. Especially after the fact, you ignore that, right? Okay. Then another issue where there is ikhtilaf, right? Now we know you have to prostrate twice. Now to do 2 prostrations, there has to be a gap between prostration 1 and prostration 2. So there's 2 things. One is that al-Rafa' min al-Sujood, what is the extent of? The one is al-Rafa' min al-Sujood, the other is al-Qu'ud bayna al-Sajdatayn. Right? Because you have to raise your head between the 2 prostrations. Otherwise, how do you have 2 prostrations? You can't say prostration 1, prostration 2. And I did 2. No. Right? So you have to raise your head. So there's one issue with respect to prostrating twice. There's one is raising your head between the 2 prostrations. And the second is the ruling of sitting there and being motionless there, right? That's the second issue. So نفس الرفع من السجود فرض, right? Right? So actually raising your head between the 2 sajdas is fard. Then اختلف في تقديره, right? There's different opinion on how much it should be. This is, and memory can be deceptive, and grabbing books from behind one's head can be even more deceptive. There are multiple opinions related to the issue. Now one thing, Imam al-Tahtawi here, he doesn't make tafsil here that there's 2 separate issues. Raising the head from the prostration is one issue. The second is it's الجلسة بين السجدتين والاطمئنان فيها. Right? So now the transmitted in the madhab about rising from ruku' is what? What's the ruling of rising from ruku' according to Abu Hanifa? It's sunnah. And if rising from ruku' is sunnah, then remaining motionless there is also sunnah in the rising from ruku'. Right? And there's the other narration that it is wajib, and al-Kamal ibn al-Humam took that. And you can read that. And similarly, that's called the qawma, or al-Rafa' min al-ruku'. And then there is al-Jalsa, the sitting between the sajdatayn. According to Abu Hanifa, it would, because there's 2 separate things. Raising your head is one, sitting is another. So sitting between the 2 sajdas, the transmitted position is that it's sunnah. And being motionless there would be sunnah. So these become 2 issues. Raising from ruku', being motionless. Sitting between the 2 sajdas and being motionless. So the asl al-madhab is the sunnah of these 4 things: raising from ruku', raising from sujood, till you're seated, and being motionless therein. Okay. So there's multiple opinions, and you can see them in the Jawhara Nayyira if we look at it. So he says, right, وَالرَّفْعُ مِنَ السُّجُودِ إِلَى قُرْبِ الْقُعُودِ عَلَى الْأَصَحِّ. Right? So raising your head from sujood such that you're closer to sitting according to the sounder opinion, عن الإمام. لأنه يعد جالسا بقربه من القعود فتتحقق السجدة بالعود بعده إليها. It says because one's considered to be sitting by being closer, by بقربه من القعود, right? Because you're considered sitting if you're closer to sitting than prostration. فتتحقق السجدة الثانية, because then the second prostration is fulfilled. بالعود إليها بعده. بالعود بعده إليها, by returning to the prostration after sitting. Does he mention the opinions? Under the arkan of the prayer. وذكر بعض المشايخ أنه إذا زايل جبهته عن الأرض ثم أعادها جازت. Some scholars mentioned that if one raises one's head from the ground and returns it, it is valid. ولم يعلم له تصحيح, and no authentication of this opinion is known. وذكر القدوري أنه قدر ما ينطلق عليه اسم الرفع. And according to al-Quduri, it is the least that would be considered to be raising one's head. Such that you did one prostration, you raise your head, and therefore you did a second prostration. دون تقدير. وجعله شيخ الإسلام أي خواهرزادة الأصح. He considered this the more authentic opinion. أو ما يسميه الناظر رافعا, or raising your head from the prostration, which is obligatory, would be what an onlooker would deem to be raising your head. Right? So it's the fourth narration. Did you mention it? Okay, we don't have to. Huh? Yes, it goes into the detail there, right? So there's multiple narrations. They're mentioned in right? And you can find this also in right? This, you can find this issue page 339 of Hashit ibn Abdin. Right? Hashit ibn Abdin 1339. You can find the issue. Right? Right? So some of the ulama says, so if you prostrated on a plank, so Sidi Hamza prostrated on a plank, and then they removed the plank and then he prostrated on the ground. Some said that this would count as two prostrations. Because You're prostrated, then they remove the plank, so you're not prostrated, then you went into a second prostration. Okay? But right? And and this opinion that's mentioned by Imam Shrumbulali here was also chosen by Al-Burhan, right? Chosen in Nahr al-Fa'iq, right? And it's more precautious to be that the fasil is that you're closer to the sitting, right? So important thing to realize, there's two separate things: al-raf' min al-sujud and then the jalsa. So here he's saying that raising your head such that you're closer to the sitting, that's the barrier between having raised the head and not having raised the head. So someone's prostrating and their head started itching, so they raised their head less than halfway up and they just got itches, so they're itching without excessive motion. I want to continue my first sajda. They went back down. If they raised their head a little bit, they could just go back to the first sajda. But if they raised closer to the qu'ud, then they can't. That's the opinion. There are other opinions. This is the balanced, practical, caution opinion, right? And there's extensive discussion about this, right? Why? Because what it's based on is, we know we have to prostrate twice. There's nothing decisive of how it is, so it's based on different taqdeer. But this is what, and you can, if someone wants to find out more, they can find out. So, Imam Shrumbulali takes a balanced, cautious, strong opinion here. Okay. ويفترض العود إلى السجود, and it's obligatory to return to prostration, meaning the second prostration, الثاني. لأن السجود الثاني كالأول فرض بإجماع الأمة, because the second prostration, like the first, is obligatory by the consensus of the ummah. ولا يتحقق كونه كالأول إلا بوضع الأعضاء السبعة, and it doesn't become like the first except by placing the 7 limbs, right, in the way mentioned before, right? Right, that the 7 limbs, meaning the required limbs, which actually don't add up to 7. The 7 mentioned are actually for wujub, not for iftirad, right? ولا يوجد التكرار إلا بعد مزايلتهما, and repetition is only realized except by lifting the head, إلا بعد مزايلتها مكانها, after it leaves its original place of prostration, الأول. فيلزمه رفعها, so one must raise the head. ثم وضعها, then place it down again. ليوجد التكرار, so that there be 2. وبه ورد السنة, and that's what has come in the sunnah, right? And this, he quotes the hadith in النسائي: كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا سجد رفع رأسه من السجدة الأولى رفع يديه من الأرض ووضعهما على فخذيه. He would, when he raised his head from the ground, he would raise his arms also from the ground and place them on his thighs. Hadith. وقال صلى الله عليه وسلم صلوا كما رأيتموني أصلي. Pray as you see me pray. Now, that does not necessarily indicate wajib, right? This is just this is being these texts are being mentioned here in a confirmatory manner, not in an affirmative manner, right? Because they don't establish the requirement of 2 prostrations, as is obvious. وقال صلى الله عليه وسلم إن اليدين تسجدان كما يسجد الوجه. The both hands prostrate just as the face prostrates. فإذا وضع أحدكم وجهه فليضعهما. So when one of you places their forehead in prostration, then place both hands in prostration. وإذا رفعه فليرفعهما. And if you raise your face, then raise both hands. Lift them off the ground, put them on your thigh. Then he mentions a hikmah. وحكمة تكرار السجود. What's the wisdom of prostrating twice? قيل تعبدي. And that's the, in terms of ta'leel, right? And there's a good definition of what's a hukm al-ta'abbudi, right? That it's it's ما لا يدرك ما لا تدرك علته ولا يقاس عليه فلا يقاس عليه, right? حكم التعبدي is that which we it's a devotional ruling that ما لا تدرك علته بالعقل بالرأي, whose legal cause is not discernible by the intellect. So we fulfill it. So one cannot use analogy in these rulings. It's limited to what has been commanded. And so there's no analogy, right? And we do it out of ubudiyah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the hukm al-ta'abbudi, we may not understand its illah, but we may understand its hikmah, its wisdom. قيل تعبدي شرعا وقيل ترغيما للشيطان, and others to put down to make the shaitan feel bad. حيث لم يسجد مرة, the shaitan didn't prostrate even once. قيل لما أمر الله سبحانه وتعالى بني آدم بالسجود عند أخذ الميثاق, and it said that when Allah Most High commanded the children of Adam to prostrate when He took the covenant from them, يوم الميثاق يوم ألست بربكم, ورفع المسلمون رؤوسهم, and the believers raised their heads, ونظروا الكفار, and they looked at the disbelievers, لم يسجدوا, they didn't prostrate on that day. خروا سجدا ثانيا شكرا للنعمة, they went into prostration a second time out of gratitude for their blessings. شكرا لنعمة التوفيق, for the blessing of توفيق وامتثال الأمر, and the blessing of fulfilling the divine command. قيل, I don't think this is established, والله أعلم, right? And then he says ويفترض القعود الأخير قدر التشهد. Now, interesting thing you'll notice, right? وتأخيره عن الأركان. It's obligatory to perform the final sitting to the extent of the tashahhud, and that the final sitting be after all the integrals. وأداؤها مستيقظا, and to perform the final sitting awake. Right? Right? And so والقعود الأخير قدر التشهد. ويفترض القعود الأخير قدر التشهد بجماع العلماء, with consensus of the ulama. Right? Though there's some narrations from Imam Malik that indicate to the contrary, but وَإِنْ اخْتَلَفُوا فِي قَدْرِهِ, and even though the ulama differed in its extent, وَالْمَفْرُوضُ عِنْدَنَا الْجُلُوسُ قَدْرَ قِرَاءَةِ التَّشَهُّدِ, what's obligatory is to sit to the extent of the recitation of the tashahhud. Fil asah, according to the more correct opinion. There's more than one opinion on this, right? لحديث ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه حين علمه التشهد إذا قلت هذا أو فعلت هذا فقد قضيت صلاتك إن شئت أن تقم فقم وإن شئت أن تقعد فاقعد. The hadith in Abu Dawood, which is very intriguing. Because the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, that when the Prophet ﷺ taught him the tashahhud, he said, once you say this or do this, you have completed your prayer. قضيت أي أديت. قضاء and أداء are used interchangeably. If you wish, you can to get up, you can get up, and if you wish to remain seated, remain seated. And this is fascinating hadith, right? Because it علق صلى الله عليه وسلم تمام الصلاة به. The Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم made the end of the prayer contingent upon upon the tashahhud, right? I.e. sitting to the extent of the tashahhud. وما لا يتم الفرض إلا به فهو فرض. And anything that the fard is not fulfilled without is itself fard. وزعم بعض مشايخنا قال رحمه الله زعم بعض مشايخنا أن المفروض في القعدة أن يأتي فيه بكلمة الشهادتين فكان فرضا عمليا. And others said, and others of our scholars imagined, and that is not correct, that what's obligatory in the sitting is to state the kalimat al-shahada, the shahadatain, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. So that is the fard amali. And this za'am indicates that this is weak. ويشترط تأخيره أي القعود الأخير is a condition that the final sitting be after عن الأركان, the integrals. إنه شرع لختمها, because the final sitting has been legislated to end them. فيعاد لسجدة صلبية تذكرها. So it is repeated, the final sitting is repeated for a prostration of the prostrations of the prayer if one remembers it. Right? And of course, ويشترط لصحة الأركان وغيرها, it's a condition for the validity of the integrals and other than them. Now this is a problematic expression, right? Right? So يشترط لصحة الأركان وغيرها. So يشترط لصحة الأركان, right? وغيرها. So it's a condition for the validity of the integrals من حيث الصحة, insofar as they're valid. وغيرها ثوابا, and other than them in reward. Right? Other than the integrals in reward. أداؤها مستيقظا, to perform them awake. فإنها فإذا ركع أو قام أو سجد نائما لم يعتد به. So if one bows or stands or prostrates asleep, it does not count. وإن طرأ فيه النوم صح بما قبله, and if one falls asleep in them, then it's valid based on what came before. Then he tells us, وَفِي الْقَاعِدَةِ الْأَخِيرَةِ خِلَافٌ. So what position? قال في منية المصلي إذا لم يعدها بطلت. In the final sitting, there's difference of opinion. Does it have to be done awake or not? Say in Munyat al-Musalli, if one does not repeat it, i.e., if one began the prostration asleep and got up, so someone rose from ruku' and fell asleep, fall into prostration, and woke up and they're out of the sajda. Far-fetched, but if it happened, then according to Munyat al-Musalli, إذا لم يعدها بطلت. If one does not repeat it, لم يعدها أي مستيقظا. Right? If one does not repeat it, meaning if one does not repeat it awake, the sajda will be invalid. وفي جامع الفتاوى يعتد بها نائما لأنها ليست بركن. And in جامع الفتاوى, it's valid, the final sitting is valid. If one does the final sitting asleep, according to, one would have to do it while awake, otherwise it's not valid. According to Munyat al-Musalli, in Jami' al-Fatawa, if one does it asleep, it does not count. In Munyat al-Musalli, in Jami' al-Fatawa, يعتد بها لأنها ليست بركن. And according to Jami' al-Fatawa, the final sitting is not an integral. ومبناها على الاستراحة, and it's based on rest. الجلسة الاستراحة. فيلائمها النوم. So it's befitting sleep. Right? That sleep doesn't go against the being. يلائمها, it's befitting it, i.e. it ليس مخالفا ليس مخالفا لها. Right? It befits it, meaning it is not against what the final sitting is. Because the final sitting, what does sitting indicate? Rest. Sleep is a type of rest. قلت وهو ثمرة الاختلاف في شرطيتها وركنيتها. So Imam al-Shumbulai says this is the thamara of the khilaf, the fruit of the difference as to whether the final sitting is a rukun or a shart. If it's a rukun, you have to do it awake. If it's a condition, you don't have to do it awake. لأن عبرة في الشروط حصولها لا تحصيلها. Because what counts in conditions is that they be fulfilled, that they be met, not that they be sought. And this is discussed in Hashd ibn Abdin as well. So Hashd ibn Abdin, volume 1, page 301. Right? So the dur, and the ulama don't mention this with a lot of. So in the dur, right? This is 1,000 years into Islamic scholarship, right? He goes, وَالَّذِي يَظْهَرُ, and what appears, أَنَّهُ شَرْط, that it's a condition. The final sitting. لأنه شرع للخروج, because the final sitting is there to now exit the prayer. So it's a wasila, it's not maqsood. But then he says وصحح في البدائع, right? But in the Badai says a rukun zaid. And Ibn Abdin inclined towards this, right? Right? But it's highly unlikely that someone would just fall asleep just for that and retain their wudu. Because if you fall asleep in the prayer, what happens to your wudu? Huh? إذا كان على هيئة السنة, the considerations of sleep apply too. To review the considerations of sleep. So what was the ruling of sleep within the prayer? If you fall asleep على جهة السنة في القيام أو في الركوع, هيئة السنة للرجال. So what about in the tashahhud? How could you sleep? That's a separate issue. We're not going to go into that. Right? And that's why Imam Shurmulali has the faqih nafs. He doesn't really, there's khilaf on it. He doesn't really. That's why he sort of couched it a little bit. Okay. Then there's another thing that in the matan, he says something that ends up being very awkward, and unless you read into it, you wouldn't understand what he means. So he says, وَإِمَّا مَعْرِفَةُ كَيْفِيَةِ الصَّلَاةِ, and it's obligatory to either know how to pray, وَمَا فِيهَا مِنَ الْخِصَالِ الْمَفْرُوضَةِ, and what it contains of obligatory matters, على وجه يميزها عن الخصال المسنونة, in a manner that distinguishes them from what are the sunnahs. So this would appear to indicate that you need to know what is fard in the prayer and what is sunnah. And this is fard and this is sunnah. أو اعتقاد أنها فرض, or believing that everything is fard. حتى لا يتنفل بمفترض, so that one does not do something as a nafil when it is actually fard. So do you have to believe that the rukn is rukn actively? That's what it seems to indicate. And this is something that some of the later scholars did say. Right? So he had, but he sort of, you could just omit the whole thing, right? Right? Because the only way this issue could arise is that if you really believe that I don't have to do ruku', but let me just do it anyways. And nobody thinks like that in the prayer, right? And even that would be yuhmal ala al-waswasa, right? But let's see. So he adjusts the matan significantly in the commentary. Says, وَيشْتَرَطُ لِصِحَّةِ أَدَاءِ الْمَفْرُوض, it's a condition for validly performing what is obligatory. إما معرفة كيفية يعني صفة الصلاة, either to know the description of the prayer, وذلك بمعرفة حقيقة ما فيها, and that's by knowing the reality of what it contains. A ما في جملة الصلوات, of what's there in the prayers. من الخصال أي الصفات الفرضية. Right? So he switches the meaning, right? Right? And that's not what the matan appears to indicate at all, and is based on another khilaf, which you can find in its place. It says, meaning to know, يعني الصفات الفرضية, يعني كونها فرضا فيعتقد افتراض ركعتي الفجر وأربع الظهر وهكذا. Meaning to know those traits of them, meaning that you believe that you know which ones are fard, so you believe that the 2 rakahs of fajr or 4 of dhuhr, etc. are fard. وهكذا بقية الصلوات المفروضة. And likewise the other obligatory prayers. فيكون ذلك على وجه يميزها عن الخصال أي الصفات المسنونة, in a manner that distinguishes them from the prayers that are sunnah, كالسنن الرواتب وغيرها باعتقاد سنية ما قبل الظهر, by believing that what's before dhuhr is sunnah, وما بعده, and likewise what's after dhuhr, after the fard dhuhr is sunnah, وهكذا. وليس المراد ولا الشرط أن يميز ما اشتملت عليه صلاة الصبح من فرض من الفرض والسنة. It's not a condition, it's not an obligation or a condition that you be able to distinguish what actions within the prayer are fard and which ones are sunnah, even though that's what the matan appears to indicate, right? Right? والسنة يعني من الفرض والسنة مثل اعتقاد فرضية القيام وسنية الثناء أو التسبيح. So you don't have to know that the standing is obligatory and the bowing is obligatory and the thana and the tasbih are sunnah. أو اعتقاد المصلي أنها أي إن ذات الصلوات التي يفعلها كلها فرض. Or if the person or the worshipper believes that all the prayers that they do are fard. But of course this would be bid'ah. ويكون هذا الاعتقاد بدعة, right? But this belief would be a bid'ah. Because خلاف المشروع. Right? كاعتقاد أن الأربعة في الفجر فرض. To believe that all 4 rak'ahs of the fajr are fard. ويصلي كل ركعتين بانفراد. But one prays 2 and then 2. ويأتي بثلاث ثم ركعتين في المغرب. Someone prays 3 and then 2 in Maghrib, and they don't know that this is fard in the Sunnah. Some unlearned people say, what do you do at Maghrib? I do 3 and 2. And they don't know this is fard, this is Sunnah. It'd be valid. So I have to do this. Okay, it's valid. But if they believe, but قد يعذر في الجاهل. This may be excuse the unlearned, but believing that the Sunnah is fard would make it a bid'ah. And there's very good discussions about that in Birgivi, Tariq al-Muhammadiyah. وَيَأْتِي بِثَلَاثٍ ثُمَّ رَكْعَتَيْنِ فِي الْمَغْرِبِ مُعْتَقِدًا فَرْضِيَّةَ الْخَمْسِ. Or someone does 3 and 2 in Maghrib, believing that all 5 are obligatory. This is valid, but bid'ah. Okay. حتى لا يتنفل بمفروض. So that one does not deem a fard prayer to be nafil. Because because that would say, it's just voluntary for me to pray the Maghrib prayer. That would not be valid, right? لأن النفل يتأدى بنية الفرض. Because the nafil is valid with the intention of the fard, but it would be a bid'ah. أما الفرض فلا يتأدى بنية النفل. But the obligatory prayer is not fulfilled with the intention of a nafil. أما الفرض, of course, is referring to as-salah, right? Because we know that it's different in Siyam. كما في التجنيس والمزيد. As in the work التجنيس والمزيد, this is the name of one book by المرغيناني. والخلاصة. ثم نبه على الأركان وغيرها فقال, and then he just mentioned what are the arkan and other than them. It says فالأركان المتفق عليها من المذكورات التي علمتها فيما تقدم. The integrals from what we have mentioned بأكثر من 27. That said there from of what's been mentioned. It's more than 27 things we mentioned. أربعة. Right? The agreed upon integrals are 4. وهي القيام والقراءة والركوع والسجود. They're the standing, recitation, bowing and prostration. وقيل القعود الأخير مقدار التشهد. And it is said that the 5th is the final sitting to the extent of the tashahhud. ركن أيضا. That it's said that it's also rukun. وقيل شرط. And others said it's a shart. وقد بينا ثمرة الخلاف. So we mentioned the fruit of the difference فيه. وقيل التحريمة ركن أيضا. And some said the opening invocation is also rukun. Right? But we took that it's a shart. Or a shart. And right? And the qila shart, it being shart, Maulana al-Tahtawi quotes it, that قود الأخير قدر التشهد being shart and not a rukun. He quotes it from a Sayyid, right? So you can see it in Sharh al-Sayyid. But the practical thing is, what if you did the whole قود الأخير قدر التشهد asleep without losing your wudu? which is not. يعني وباقيها أي المذكورات شرائط بعضها شرط لصحة الشروع في الصلاة وهو ما كان خارجها وهو الطهارة من الحدث والخبث وستر العورة واستقبال القبلة والوقت والنية والتحريمة وغيره شرط لدوام صحتها وقد علمت ذلك بفضل الله ومنه وله الشكر على التوفيق لجمعها بعد التفريق. Says, and the rest of what's mentioned are conditions. Some of them conditions for validity, for beginning the prayer, and these are the things that are outside it, like being pure from minor and major ritual impurity and from filth, and covering the awrah and facing the qibla and the time and the intention and the opening invocation. And some of them are conditions for remaining on validity, and you've seen what they are by the grace of Allah and His bounty, and His is all gratitude for His facilitation in gathering them after they were disparate. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. And then he mentions فصل في متعلقات الشروط وفروعها. Then he mentions investigations related to the conditions and their details. We'll stop there. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. And we've mentioned a number of things where there's tafsil, etc. Don't miss those things, please. Yes?
Rather than lifting one's head between sajdas, is it sufficient to interrupt one's prostration by lifting a condition or integral of it and then refilling it by lifting the toes of both feet, for instance?
No. Because لا يعد رافعا. So, I mean, if in prostration, for a moment you lifted both hands and both toes, both feet, right? Like, you started scratching both feet with both toes in prostration, you would still be in prostration. I mean, it'd be makruh, like, unless it was totally unavoidable, but okay.
Zayn was asking, a lot of tafsil is done on the section about the conditions and integrals. Why won't he just list the 7 and 5 and then here's the tafsil for each of them?
Because the assumption is, why is all this detail mentioned for the 7 and 5? Well, one, because they're not necessarily 7 and 5, as we see, right, about the Qawd al-Akhir. Because this is the reason, and he thanks Allah for the Jam'a Ba'd al-Tafriq, is because this is what the prayer depends upon, right? Most texts mention these quite briefly, and then they move on to the description of the prayer, the wajibs and the sunnahs. But really the most important thing is, if the prayer is valid, then khalas, you've prayed. Then even if someone has shortcoming, but they prayed, right? On the Day of Judgment, they won't be judged amongst those who did not pray, right? And especially if it's out of just general shortcoming, as opposed to disregard. ولا يخفى ما هو الأولى والأفضل. Right? What's yeah, so that's and this chapter, for example, highlights what Maulana what Maulana al-Shrumbulali is doing in the text, right? That he wrote this, هذا متن جمعت فيه ما تفرق, right? That this I gathered in this what was spread out in the larger works, right? So this is a very beneficial chapter, and this is really one needs to ground one's understanding on. And there's daqa'iq, right? Even Imam Shrumbulali, you see, bunch of these issues, like the issues of الشروع والقراءة and the اختصار على الجبهة لعاجز ولغير العاجز, right? So there's right, Imam Shumba gathered them, but in these three issues, we don't, like Ibn Abdin and others point out that he didn't necessarily get it right. Right? So if you're being tested, you're not going to be tested at this level on, so what are the arkan of the prayer? If someone asks that kind of question, you say, ma salama, leave the class. The things to be asked on are madaqqa min al-umur. What does Imam Shurumulali say about placing both feet? And you notice that he says one thing in the matan, he says another in the sharh. Why does that happen? Because there's ikhtilaf. What is the ikhtilaf? Right? So these things require dabt. Please take notes. Right? Please take notes. Notes of the text itself and catch what is mentioned. Right? Because we're being very selective in what we mention, but certain places need taqeed, and that don't miss those things. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد.
And two more questions. See, Hamza was asking, is the Mu'jiz accessible for us to read on our own? What are some accessible?
As a whole book? What do you mean by accessible to read on your own? Yeah, so we can answer the follow-up. What's the next question?
See, Zain was asking, where can one find adab of recitation of Quran and dua in the prayer with Hanafi basis?
Adab of Qira'at al-Quran. So the Sifat al-Salah discusses what the Qira'at al-Masnoona. So it's mentioned in the Maraqi coming up. What's the Qira'at al-Masnoona? So that mentions it. Then if one looks at works like Shir'at al-Islam, goes into the Adab al-Qira'ah. If you look at the description of the prayer, then one looks at Adab al-Quran that are mentioned in these works that we're looking at. Tahtawi mentions them in these places. Adab al-Qira'ah, Adab al-Quran come in a number of places of istima', this and that. Then, because it's adab amma of Quran, right? What the ahkam, the fuqaha is concerned, are the ahkam. Those ahkam are found in the Maraqi itself sufficiently. The ahkam are also found, for example, if you look in Mulla Ali al-Qari on al-Hisn al-Hasin, Sharh Shir'at al-Islam, other books on adab of the Quran from Hanafi scholars, but then adab al-Quran that umuman that are found, one of the best books on the subject is Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin's work, right? Even Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin's work, As-Salatu fil Islam, right? So his Tilawatul Quran, but also his As-Salatu fil Islam is an awesome book, right? And he has it's an amazing work, right? Right, of its virtues and adab, and right, and he has it's a really beautiful work. Okay. So what was meant by the question?
He was asking adab of dua after the Quran, like in the prayer. How do you make dua after saying Quran? What's the adab of that?
That it came, didn't it? Right. We just took that in the section on qira'ah here. It's mentioned in Tahtawi. Right? So when the Imam should not do it unless they do it in their heart. The follower doesn't do it because they're supposed to be silent unless they do it just in their heart. In a nafil prayer, one can do it. either in your heart, and it's recommended there to do it because it's established from the Prophet ﷺ in his nafil. Some Hanafi say just to oneself, right? Because, or if one does it with one's own voice, one actually says it, like so. Say, like. If someone says, "Inna al-insana lafi khusr," you say, "Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-khusran." But you say it in a distinct voice, right? You like lower your voice with it, for example. Or "Alaysa Allahu bi ahkam al-hakimin." It's come in narration that one says, "Alaysa Allahu bi ahkam al-hakimin." Bala wa nahnu ala dhalika min al-shahidin. And some of the Salaf added to it, "Wash-shakidin walhamdulillah." But that one either lowers or the other says, one says it li-nafsihi. We'll stop there, inshallah. And the mujaz, the parts that were mentioned, yes. If you've not studied usul yet, then the thing to do is to get to study usul. But it's getting ahead of oneself to do that. If someone wanted to read a brief work of usul, then they should should consult what should one do. And there's easier. Someone wants to do just a brief, quick intro to usul. There's other simpler things. The mujaz is very detailed. That's not a starting point.
Asking what works could be a starting point.
A work that one says with a teacher. And there's a lot to memorize and a lot to do in the meantime, right? So we should do that, right? Because you need the most important thing is to do what's in front of one. So right now, much more important than thinking about usul or this or that, is if you haven't memorized the Nur al-Idah yet, what you have to, if you want to do something more in fiqh, is memorize Nur al-Idah. Says, what else do I do? Memorize Nur al-Idah. What else do I want to do? Memorize Nur al-Idah. Know the text, so that there's nothing that we've covered that you could not make taqreer of in your sleep. Right? Like someone shows up, if we wake them up and they're in their pajamas, I say, okay, what is the ruling of placing, what do you have to place in sujood? You could say Bismillah and you could just explain the whole thing out without having to look at the text. That's ilm. Everything else is just a pale imitation. So that's what requires attention. You have to memorize the text. You have to know what you study. You need to know fully. Right? Everything else comes in its due place. We haven't done usul yet. There's a few particular things we pointed out. Get those well. Right? And if you look up the definitions for those, it'll help you crack open those texts. Let's get through Quduri, and then we'll attack. We'll attack the next text, and there's a lot of fiqh coming up. Someone who has himmah in the summer, by the summer I'll be starting something new, I'll be starting the next level text in fiqh. Shaykh Abdul Rahim Riyasat will be doing twice a week fiqh class, and Shaykh Salman Yunus will be doing twice a week fiqh class. Someone wants to overdose on fiqh, you could potentially be doing, and that's an open door. Like at the same time, someone who's in the flow could be doing a lot of hours of fiqh. So potentially, someone wants to give a year and a half, they can conceivably complete the Kanz and the Multaqa and the Lubab and Sharh al-Wiqaya in a year and a half to 2 years. But we'll discuss that separately. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.